I'm going to try and combine two presentations I've been giving, one on energy policy, exploring the energy race. And of course, this applies to the transportation policy because the federal government is trying to promote electricity as a way to power our buses and power our cars, and of course, to heat our homes, making that decision. But who decides? And I argue in the energy race, different technologies are progressing rapidly. We don't know which is going to be best. Geothermal, natural gas, wind power, solar power, they're all advancing, all improvements. We don't know which cars are best for federal transportation policy. Should the government be promoting hydrogen cars, hybrid cars, plug-in hybrid cars, electric cars, natural gas powered cars, or what the public seems to want are internal combustion engines that are far cleaner than they used to be in terms of much reduced pollution. So why is the federal government, why is legislation, why are politicians making these decisions? And the argument is let individual people make the decisions. People in rural areas, electric cars don't work for them when they've got long distances to drive. People in cities, often smaller electric cars can work great. But there's the energy race. Government trying to decide, politicians trying to make decisions for us to nudge us toward the energies they think are best, they believe are best, that are cleaner, more reliable, more affordable. The market view is to let people make these decisions and to be sort of humble in the sense that we don't have the information about what's best for everyday people. We don't have the knowledge that local people have. Those decisions should be decentralized. Then I step into another area. Again, I'm going to try and combine these talks. Not only the energy to power our economy, where government is involved, but what about the energy to fuel our bodies? We need energy too. And we operate on fuel systems. We are electrical as well as chemical energy sources. So who decides what food we eat or what food policies guide us toward healthy eating? Well, turns out the government does too. And the argument I'm making is the federal government, federal agencies are making a series of mistakes in nutrition and dietary guidelines that are similar to the mistakes, misguided ideas they're making in the overall economy. So we're poorer, we're paying a lot more for energy. Our energy system is less reliable, is intermittent, the critics say, because of wind and solar and the lack of energy storage. Similarly, our bodies are unhealthy. We're suffering from a series of chronic health problems caused by the federal government promoting intermittent energy in a sense of high carbohydrate diets. So the food presentation I gave at Liberty International in Madrid last summer and gave a presentation last week at the Free Market Institute at Brookfield Academy in Wisconsin. And I'm going to try and mash up these slides as I go along, and I hope it's interesting. If it's not, maybe you're already gone already. So food policies, food follies. I draw from the research of Dr. Roger Williams, University of Texas biochemist. One of his popular books, Nutrition Against Disease. He wrote Nutrition in a Nutshell, Free and Unequal, many other books, and his textbook on biochemical individuality is still in print. Basically, Williams is arguing that we're all different. We're different, and just as we look different, our internal biochemistry is different. I'll talk about that, and so our nutritional needs are different. I wrote a paper for the Goodman Institute, Did the Government Make Us Fat?, that drew from the movie Fat Fiction, the research of Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes on the misguided food pyramid that sort of sent us on the wrong track. And now Americans are way overweight, high blood pressure, many are obese, metabolically unhealthy. The argument is much of this is not caused by fast food or going out to dinner or not moving around enough. Instead, it's caused by following the federal dietary guidelines. which again are influenced by the argument goes big business and so forth. Okay, I write at normalnutrition.substack, where you can read more of what I've tried to guide people to on this. Okay, so food policies, food follies, individuality was a theme of this seminar at the Free Market Institute. Individuality in not only the freedoms we should have, but also in our biochemical individuality. We learn differently. Some people are visual learners, others aren't. Our brains work differently. Our internal biochemistry is different. We're really different inside. Our livers are different sizes. Our hearts are different sizes in different places. The sort of thing you see in biology class of human anatomy, that's an average. Nobody looks like that. Our intestines are very different lengths. And the microbes within us are vastly different as well, which was not so much known when Dr. Williams was writing. So we are extraordinary. We're all way above average in a lot of different ways, but we're below average in other ways. If you have a Gaussian distribution curve for, how our stomachs, intestines, our sense of smell and taste vary from person to person. Todd Rose, in his book, End of Average, looks at this in another way, that the whole idea of averages that we use for grading and in policies is mixed up because nobody's average. We're all different, and we should be treated as different. We should have a free system where we could choose the jobs we want, the education we want, the books we want to read, and so forth. So we're different from person to person. That's why we like different foods, partly because our taste buds are different. And the foods we crave are often craved by the microbes in our gut that signal for things that are tied in with our brain, but also we're affected by advertising, by habits, by what we grew up with, by the food around us. But we really have this question of what foods provide us the best nutrition. We want healthy people. Roger Williams argues that food, nutrition against disease, that what we eat is beneficial to our health. What we get from doctors in the terms of pills and prescriptions are often treating symptoms of underlying disease that have more to do with lifestyle, how much exercise we get, and how we deal with stress and sleep, and particularly the foods we eat. So the government got into this big way. Got into nutrition in a big way. There's a history to this of a sort of an epidemic of heart attacks in the 50s and 60s, especially. Dwight Eisenhower, as president, was having a series of heart attacks, and the theory was adopted that these heart attacks were caused by saturated fat, by people eating saturated fat. The food pyramid was promoted by people who very much preferred eating bread, cereal, rice, pasta, 6 to 11 servings a day, then fruits and vegetables, 2 to 4 servings, and then less of meat, poultry, eggs, and very little of fat, oils, and sweets. So this food pyramid was recommended by the federal government, by the Federal Dietary Guidelines, 1992 to 2005. Then they switch it. It turns out there isn't research for this. The research they thought they had turned out to be misleading in various ways. So they switched it over to the food plate, the My Plate, and you can see on this grains, vegetables, fruits, and then protein and a bit of dairy. And of course they need dairy because the milk lobby won't support it otherwise. But what's the evidence to support this as what everyone should get? And it's very weak. So here you can go on the federal government dietary guidelines website. They have their food plate, and you're supposed to learn about what's best. It says this is based on decades of solid science, can help you day by day make half your plate fruits and vegetables, focus on whole fruits, whole grains, vary your protein routine, and limit saturated fat and sodium and sugars. Now, critics of this say there isn't evidence to support reducing saturated fat or even sodium. Now, there's a lot of evidence that sugar is a problem, particularly processed carbohydrates and sugars, ultra-processed foods. It says to go to low-fat, fat-free dairy. There is not evidence to support fat-free dairy, low-fat yogurt. Instead, Whole fat tends to be healthier, but whole fat's not even available for sale, whole fat milk in schools. So what do kids eat? What do they drink? They drink low-fat milk if they drink any milk, and they have chocolate milk with lots of sugar in it because low-fat skim milk doesn't taste very good. So, but this is what the federal government's telling us to do, and this determines what food is served in public schools, public hospitals, prisons, the military, and the argument is this has contributed to the obesity and diabetes. And in fact, the government is telling us, the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association is following the federal guidelines, telling people to eat things, the food served in hospitals that make people sicker, fatter, and less healthier. So the blame is that these institutions have been captured or unduly influenced by industry, medical associations who are sort of locked into these theories about what foods are healthy. They think it's low fat, it's not low fat. Let's jump back from nutrition to energy markets. Again, government telling us what energy for our bodies. It turns out to be wrong. It's been wrong for decades. Our bodies are suffering because of it. Our healthcare costs are high because of it. Now government has been telling us what kind of energy to use, particularly in the last 20 years, that we should stop using natural gas. It's now illegal or becoming illegal in much of the country. Homes are being switched over to heat pumps and electricity. You can't even install new natural gas in many cities. And they argue that that's for our own good. It's good for society. It's good for the economy. It's good for the planet. But again, the argument is this is based on poor and misleading research. I have a flyer here where I'm proposing the Stossel or recommending Stossel in the classroom resources and their student contests, as well as a series of books from the Institute for Economic Affairs. The national debate topic is on economic inequality. And you could argue, they argue, we need a lot more fiscal transfers from rich to poor. Market approach might be we need a lot less government intervention in energy policy, which raises the cost of energy that hurts the poor, not the wealthy, that raises the cost of housing that hurts the poor, not the wealthy. We need more entrepreneurship. We need more trade and globalization and economic freedom, all those general arguments. Now, background to all this, I'm not trying to tell students what to think. I'm instead trying to encourage people to do your research, your own research, your thinking, develop your communication skills, look at resources online, and that the process of high school and homeschool debate, which are the audiences I'm advertising to here or promoting, that you guys are the most important people in the planet. You are learning not only to advocate reforms, calling for more markets or for more government. I helped sponsor a deliberative dialogue program with the Vancouver Debate Academy, and they chose a resolution calling for the government to provide public housing in Vancouver. Now, I would disagree with that, economists would disagree with that, but the students themselves had an opportunity to disagree with that. This was a British parliamentary style. 3 students on the affirmative advocated a bigger government role in taking responsibility for homelessness and housing in Vancouver. And the negative got to argue, well, hey, that's a bad idea, and here's why. Here's why that's not going to work. These students engaged, and students had an opportunity to see the different perspectives and argue for and against. And in debate competitions at a tournament, they switch sides. So on energy policy, for the topic for the STOA League, many students are advocating phasing out federal wind and solar subsidies, phasing out renewable fuel standards, fleet standards, but they also have to understand the arguments against it because they may end up on the negative where someone else is running that case and they want to find out some of the weaknesses. So when affirmative says we're going to eliminate renewable fuel standards over the next 2 years because they're problematic in a lot of ways, the negative says, well, the study you cite says to do it in 5 years. Why would you do it in 2 years if it takes 5 years? Or they could argue these standards are good, that ethanol is important. Again, debating gives young people an opportunity to see the different arguments and to engage in the real world debate. There are strong advocates of ethanol. If you're debating in Iowa, where people are corn farmers and own ethanol processing plants, they're in favor of the status quo, most likely. Okay, so there's an organization called American Lyceum that Bob Latan co-founded, and they're trying to advance better discussion and debate in public and in high school. Bob's book, Resolve Debate, can, what does it read? Debate can revolutionize education and help save our democracy. You can read his book. I have a link to the article about this he did for the Brookings Institution. But every high school course should be taught at least partly in a debate format so students can see the different sides. The founding, you're reading the founding era. What about the Constitution? Was it a good idea? Well, the founders debated it. The ratification debates across the country, advocates like Patrick Henry, George Mason were adamantly opposed to the Constitution. They thought it would remove limits on the size and scope of the central government. Maybe they were right, but just as they debated it, maybe we should debate it. And why should a document passed centuries ago by people long dead bind us today? That's worth discussing and debating. My nonprofit, Economic Thinking, argues that economics can improve the quality of debate so that students debating inequality or housing policy, transportation, energy policy have this toolkit for understanding the seen and the unseen. What Frederick Bastiat talks about, that any policy promoting particular kinds of energy is going to have unseen, unintended consequences that may be more costly and hurtful than the benefits that may come from those policies. I draw from the book The Economic Way of Thinking by Paul Hayne, providing a toolkit for understanding most policy issues, whether it's immigration, housing, energy, transportation, economic inequality, and again, these are current debate topics. And energy, I have resources here. Blue Energy Nation, the Empowerment Alliance, the Institute for Economic Research, Master Resource. These are all pro-market think tanks and blogs that are advocating for market reforms in energy, whether it's more nuclear, more geothermal, more natural gas. The government shouldn't be making the decisions for us of winners and losers in energy policy. Energy should be clean, reliable, affordable. Transportation should be clean, reliable, affordable. Government promoting electric vehicles, well, they're clean at the point of the energies used in the car. They may or may not be clean where the energy is produced, if it's in a coal plant or somewhere else, or where the lithium is mined in other countries. But in any case, why should the federal government be picking winners and losers in the car industry? Maybe natural gas cars are far cleaner, far more affordable. Maybe hydrogen cars are. Maybe you could power a car with a rubber band or a flywheel. Or the Flintstones, they use their feet to power their cars. A comedian once asked, why bring the car if you're powering it with your feet? But the Flintstones is a cartoon. So I don't advocate a Flintstone-based transportation policy. Although maybe you want to ride bikes. The federal government says we should all live closer together. We can walk from place to place. Better for our health, maybe for the environment. Okay, energy markets and central planning. Just as food shouldn't be central planned because the governments make mistakes, the criticism of socialism and communism is you have a central planning agency thought they could plan the economy. They couldn't. Soviet and communist countries, Eastern Europe, they collapsed in part because the federal government tried to make these choices about how to grow wheat or how much corn to plant, where to build factories, what to produce. They couldn't do it because they didn't have operating markets, they didn't have price signals. The benefits of decentralized decision making. Local people have better insight about what energy works. Here in Seattle, where I am, we have huge amounts of water from the Columbia River and other rivers, so we give a lot of hydropower. So it makes sense to generate energy from dams. Now, there's ecological problems with that, but how do you deal with that? We measure, we make the decision how much energy from nuclear, how much from hydro, how much from coal, wind, and solar. Those decisions are local here. They don't work so well in Iowa, where it's flat, where you don't have as much hydro. So energy policy varies from place to place. Also, by the way, hydro, particularly in California, it allows for irrigation and to reduce flooding because you've got these reservoirs to absorb water in flood times and save the water for drought times later, which is normal in much of the country. The argument is federal energy policy has been captured by special interests, just like food and nutrition policy has. Each department in energy, its advocates top-down policies reform guided by bureaucrats and bureaucracies. Right now, we're big into promoting wind and solar. The next administration, if it's Republican, may cut all or most of the wind and solar subsidies. Advocates of wind and solar, though, can also say wind and solar are so cost-effective now compared to what they were 10 or 20 years ago, they don't need these subsidies. In fact, these subsidies distort the kind of wind that's invested in, and they distort the kind of solar power. And so federal government funding, when it's directed to one kind of energy, is problematic. You could also, I talked to a student the other day who had debated energy policy. His case called for cutting subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. And this is mostly an accelerated depreciation. But sure, cut those subsidies as well. You want a level playing field where different kinds of energy can compete. In terms of transportation, we've got a big challenge in how do you transport energy from where it's produced to where people use it. So, for example, wind farms, they're actually not farms, they're factories, wind industrial institutions out in the countryside or solar operations out in the countryside, that you have to build expensive high power lines to transport that energy to the city. And the same with hydropower. So a lot of even though hydropower is cheap once the dams are built, it costs money to high tension lines to get that power to market. You lose energy in the process. Okay. So again, special interest groups, whether they're the wind power people, the solar power people, the natural gas people, the coal people, they're all trying to get benefits for their industry or at least stop the regulations that they see are hurting them. In the transportation business, the Jones Act, for example, is a ocean transportation policy that restricts shipping anything between two U.S. ports. It has to be in a U.S. flagged, owned, and staffed vessel. But for all the natural gas, liquid natural gas being exported from Louisiana and Texas, none of the vessels are U.S. owned, so they can't deliver that natural gas to New England, which is short of natural gas, or to California. So the Jones Act is a restriction on the transportation of energy that raises the cost of energy in the U.S. and decreases the reliability. Similarly, various federal environmental regulations increase the cost of transporting electricity from place to place because of the permitting, the NEP standards, National Environmental Standards, the EPA regulations, NEPA, as well as shipping natural gas, oil pipelines. All these things are restricted artificially. That hurts wind and solar as well as natural gas. We need to be able to produce things. This is a flyer from my energy workshops I had earlier. So I encourage students not to take civilization for granted. It requires the grid, electricity. This documentary, Juice, is recommended as well as other resources. We're living on the knife's edge. The electricity has to be exactly the right amount. It doesn't get stored in our grid system. If it, is too low, our appliances don't work. If it's too high, our stuff is shorted out. This knife's edge leads to blackouts and brownouts in California and Texas, the places with the most wind and solar, you could argue, although wind and solar people blame fossil fuels. New York almost went under winter before last. Of could have led to thousands of lives lost. These things happen in the status quo, and the system is getting worse because of current federal energy policies and transportation of energy policies that are baked into the status quo. Students can reform those, lowering energy costs, improving reliability, making America a better place, and reducing emissions, which is part of the global warming climate change concern. So again, I'm advocating the energy race, energy students and transportation of energy students. We're talking about the discovery of where energy is, production of energy, distribution, consumption. Here where I am, I'm looking out at Puget Sound. The biggest source of energy is the moon. Millions of gallons of water are pulled out of Puget Sound and put back every day. Could we produce energy from tidal currents? And in fact, they do. There's tidal kites that are in operation around the world generating energy from the tides. Companies are trying to generate energy from wave motion. We, in a sense, don't care where the energy comes from. We encourage entrepreneurs and enterprises to try and find the cheapest, the most affordable, the most reliable energy they can, and to produce it. In Europe right now, there's movement into new drilling for natural gas. They don't do much hydraulic fracturing in Europe. Now new companies are doing that, starting up again, because since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, much of Russian cheap natural gas is cut off. So Europe is importing natural gas and restarting coal plants. They've shut down nuclear outside of France. So energy is expensive, which is damaging the German economy and other economies throughout Europe. They're pushing into wind and solar in a big way. And to some extent that works, 5%. Once you get above that, you get reliability problems in the grid. But anyway, more to that. Students can research that on their own. Production, distribution, and consumption. Right now, the federal government is trying to control how we distribute energy, pipelines and electric power lines, and the Department of Energy is also trying to control how we consume energy. That is, deciding whether our home appliances use this amount of energy or that, natural gas or electricity, promoting heat pumps. The Permitting Institute is nonpartisan. They don't care whether it's wind and solar or natural gas. They focus on permits. If you can't get a permit for it, you can't build it. And that damages all sorts of energy production and distribution. So focus on permits and permitting reforms there, which is useful for debaters because you're saying, look, we just think permitting should be improved and let the market decide, other systems decide which kind of energy is better for the public. So discovery, federal energy regulations decide where and when you can drill and search for oil on government land. Federal government just put a pause on new liquid natural gas construction and export, so that's a policy decision that disrupts long-term planning. Again, drilling for oil and gas, mining for minerals. You want lithium, but you can't get a permit to mine lithium. We're short of uranium for nuclear. You can't get a permit to mine for uranium. There's a huge mountain of uranium in Virginia. They can't get a permit even to mine for it. So, time to build. And this is a Competitive Enterprise Institute, looks at reforming NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which again, for debaters with energy or transportation, you focus on why those reforms are needed. And of course, the transportation topic is restricted to the Department of Transportation policies. So, LNG terminals, Jones Act, high voltage line, consumptions, your right to heat your meals and home, who decides, how do you power your car, internal combustion, electricity, hydrogen, hybrid, natural gas, or rubber bands, flywheels. So, switch back to how we power our economy, to how we power our bodies. This is what the federal government is suggesting for the dietary guidelines for America. They chose this picture. I'm not sure how nutritious and appealing that looks to you. It's certainly colorful. The photographer has chosen a nice design, but the criticism is that's the kind of food the government is suggesting for us as healthy, and it's a problem. So join us as we celebrate nutrition. These are tools for consumers to eat healthy on a budget. So because low-income people have less money, they spend more for food. Look at the food they recommended on this. Maybe that's just a graphic, watermelon, broccoli, various different things. What's missing from there? Well, it turns out the food that's most nutritious, fish, meat, eggs, aren't in that picture. So the argument is the federal government has, just as it's misguided its push for the kinds of energy we use and consume for our houses and our cars, it's also misguided the food we power our bodies with. The Center for Disease Control now says, look, 90% of the nation's $3.8 trillion annual budget in healthcare is for chronic conditions, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and mental health conditions. The Nutrition Coalition and others argue that most of these are lifestyle, and the federal government guidelines are the source of the problem.